Hello and welcome to another mini lecture on CS200. In this case, we're going to talk about Chapter 8, User-Defined Methods. This builds on what we talked about in Thursday's class. In this section, or in this little mini lecture, we're going to talk about return values. Let's go to the Zybooks and see what it says. Okay. So here's an important thing to remember. We can only pass one value back. So if we have multiple values to pass back, we need to do different things, which we'll learn about in later chapters. So right now, what we have is an example. Now this example declares a class square computation, and then it declares a method called compute square. In this compute square definition, what we do is we have an int that we're going to pass as a parameter called num_square. What happens is that value is passed in, and then it's squared by multiplying it times itself, and then it's returned back to the calling function or method. So below we have our main method. We declare num_squared as an integer, and that's going to hold the value that's going to be squared. So we say num_squared equals compute square, and we pass it the argument 7. So it goes up there and becomes 7 in the compute square, and then 7 times 7 is returned, and it's going to be returned to num_squared here. Then last we print out 7 squared is, and then whatever value is returned from calling that method. I have a modified version of this, which I'll show you now. The method I have, or the class, actually does a bunch of different things, okay? We have our initial class, much like we saw in that example, okay, called compute square, does exactly the same thing. But I've added a couple of different examples to look at. The next example is returns nothing, and it receives as a parameter num_square, okay? But you notice that the type is void, which means that it returns nothing, right? So it's not expected to return a value. However, we've done something a little bit peculiar. We've actually have a return statement that actually returns nothing, and this is valid. Next, we have returns the whole string. So the initial one that we saw in the example in the Zybooks is one that just returns a value, a number. So it returns an int. We see that int here. In this case, we're going to return the entire string. So instead of just returning a number, we're actually going to build the entire string in the method and then return that string to be printed back in main. Next, we're going to look at a Boolean condition. Okay, so in this case, we're going to just test to see whether something's true or false and return a Boolean, which happens a lot in a lot of methods, because what we want to do is we just want to do some kind of comparison test and see if that value is indeed true or false. Okay, so let's look down here where we do the call. In the main, we declare 3 variables, num_squared. We have string to print, which we declare as a string. And then we also have is it really squared, which we set initially to false. The reason why we set it initially to false is because it is most likely going to be true, because when we do it, we pass in a value, say 7. That's the argument. It replaces the parameter num_square. So squared value, say for example that's a 7 for num_square, squared value will become 49 because it's 7 times 7. And then we look at this if condition. So if 49 divided by 7 equals 7, which it always will, then we're going to return true. So really, for the purposes of this test, the is comparison true method is always going to return true. So the best way to test that is to set it initially to false and then look at how the value changes. So what happens in our main method here? So we do, like the example in the Zybook, we actually do num_squared equals compute 7, and then we print the result. But we also do another thing. We do the returns nothing, which remember is our void method. and we say after calling returns nothing, 7 squared is, and then a value. Next, we change the value, the argument to 8. We say string to print equals return the whole string. Remember, that's the one that took the string and created the whole string to be printed. So all we're doing is we're doing a system out print line string to print. So whatever value is returned from that method is what we're going to print. Now I caution you against doing this because typically we want our methods to do one thing and do one thing well. So in the one where we do compute square, which we got from the textbook, all it does is do the calculation. We worry about the printing and the formatting back in the main method. However, in this one, it's just to show you that we can pass a string. It's not advised that we create the string in the method and then just print whatever is returned. Then last we have, is it really squared? So we're passing it a value of 9, or an argument of 9, and then we're going to see if it's going to be true or false when it comes back. Okay? So this is just testing different types of methods and return values and seeing what happens. First of all, we test the compile. It compiles fine. We're going to close it, and then we're going to run it. Oops, let me clear this. And let's run it again. And so what we get is 7 squared is 49. That is exactly like what the textbook said. And then after calling returns nothing, 7 squared is 49. So you can see here that, remember that method that just has a return and does nothing, actually does nothing. So it changes the value not at all. Next, we have the one where we actually create the print string inside the method, but we pass it an argument of 8, and we see that it works just fine. And then last, we did that Boolean condition. Is it really squared? Remember, initially we set the Boolean to false, and then the value you can see changed as we expect and returns a true value. So with the return, we can actually do quite a bit. Now, one thing I would suggest is if you have an opportunity, do try these participation activities. They're designed to be quick, but they actually contain a lot of useful information, a lot of information that can help you with programming. So you see here, you can test out different values, and depending on what you get, it gives you a good explanation. This is good for debugging, and I encourage you to try each of these as you go along. Okay. So as we've seen, we can actually call methods and expressions. We did that with some of the examples we saw in BlueJ. So mathematical methods. A good idea is to just stick to one thing in a method. So one particular purpose. Again, we saw the example in BlueJ in which we actually printed or created a statement to be printed when we got back to our main method. This is not encouraged except in particular situations. Why? Because if we ever need to change the format of that string that we want to print, it's a lot easier to do in the main method and just get the value back from the method that we called. So here's a couple of examples. You can actually call methods from other methods. So this is kind of nice because you can actually have sub-methods, if you will, that do particular functions or functions or activities that support a particular need. So for example, doing a square or squaring a number or creating a print string to be printed could be separate methods, and you could call them when they're needed. So just realize that methods can call other methods, and this can be useful, but it also can lead to difficulty in deciphering exactly where changes happen. So I encourage you to go through these exercises just as we looked at in the Thursday lecture. I think these will lead to a better understanding of exactly how to do different different designs of methods, and you'll see as you get more experience with them that it's something that's very straightforward, but it does require a little bit of practice.